If you ever drank in a British pub before the millennium, you knew the Bass red triangle, the mark on every bottle, on every bar, from Burton to Bombay for a century. At its peak, Bass was the largest brewery on Earth, 1 million barrels a year from 16 miles of private railway. 1 in every 4 pints drunk in Britain came from Burton. It survived 2 world wars. It survived the loss of the empire that had carried its name across the planet, the rise of lager that should have killed every cask brewer in Britain, the disappearance of the regional breweries that had once made Burton famous. And then, after more than 200 years of brewing in Burton, the company that had carried the name was gone. How does a name that meant Britain to half the world simply stop belonging to it? What really happened inside those gates? Chapter 1. The Carrier from Hinckley. Burton-upon-Trent in the county of Staffordshire, a town built on water. Not the water that ran in the river beneath its bridges, though that water mattered too. The water that lay deeper, sunk in the sandstone aquifer beneath the streets, gathered for millennia through gypsum strata, rich in calcium sulfate, sharper than any other water in England, 800 parts per million. Benedictine monks at Burton Abbey had been drawing it from the ground since the 12th century, brewing ale before half of England had thought to write the word down. But this is not their story. This story begins on the road. In 1754, on the carrier's route between Manchester and London, the slow trade in beer and hats and ironmongery hauled by wagon over packhorse paths and turnpikes. 2 brothers ran the business, John Bass, the elder, William Bass, the younger. They were sons of a Hinckley plumber and glazier who died when William was 15, leaving them to find their living however they could. Within a year, William held the whole concern alone. He was 38. He'd been on the road since boyhood. He knew the customers, the brewers in Burton who needed their casks shifted south, the hat makers and tool makers whose wares filled the wagon beds, the inns where horses were changed, and ale was drunk, and the gossip of England moved between towns at the speed of a draft horse's walk. His chief client was a Burton brewer named Benjamin Printon. He carried beer for Leeson, for Musgrave, for Clay, for Evans, for Lovat. He carried felt hats. He carried spades and axes and screws and the hardware that came out of Thomas Thornwill's works in Burton. He carried other men's beer for 30 years. In 1756, he married Mary Gibbons, daughter of Michael Gibbons, who kept the Red Lion Inn at Holborn, near the London depot where William's wagons unloaded. A practical match, born of the trade. The Bass family settled in Burton, midway between the carrier's 2 ends, in a modest house at Nether Hall. They could have stayed in London. They could have stayed in Manchester. They chose Burton, partly because of the trade, partly because the Trent and Mersey Canal was being planned, and a canal would change everything for a town that already made the country's finest pale ale. William had a hand on every cask of beer that left Burton for the south. He saw the books. He knew the margins. And in 1777, at the age of 60, an age when most men of his time were either dead or retired or both, he sold the carrier business to a young family of Quaker hauliers named Pickford. He took the money, and he bought a house at 136 High Street, Burton-upon-Trent, built in 1750, with an adjoining brewery and malt house. He had been a carrier for 30 years. He would be a brewer for 10. Chapter 2. A house on the High Street. The brewery William Bass bought was small. So was Burton itself, a market town of perhaps 3,000 souls, lying on the Trent, dominated by the ruins of its medieval abbey and the brewing trade that had outlived it. There were already brewers in Burton when Bass arrived to join them. The Worthingtons, the Wilsons, the Evanses. There would soon be more. He had chosen the place not for its water, though the water mattered, and the men who paid him to haul their casks knew it mattered. The chemistry of it wouldn't be properly understood for another 45 years. He had chosen it for its position, the midpoint between his 2 great markets, the terminus of a canal that would soon open, the town that already supplied the ironmongers of the Midlands and the gentlemen of London and the merchants of the Baltic with sharp, clear, sulphurous pale ale. In 1784, with the brewery still small but the trade steady, he sent his first consignment overseas, to St. Petersburg, Russia. The route went by wagon to Hull, where the casks were loaded onto ships, and from Hull across the North Sea to the Baltic ports, to the merchants of Russia, who'd developed a taste for British pale ale that nobody fully understood. The strength of the beer, perhaps. The chemistry of Burton's water surviving a long sea journey, while London's softer porter spoiled in its casks. The cold Russian winters that demanded something stronger than ordinary table beer. Whatever the reason, the Baltic trade became Burton's first great export market. By 1799, Bass beer was crossing the Atlantic too, landing in the ports of the new American Republic, casks bearing a name that nobody in Boston or Philadelphia had yet learned to pronounce. William Bass died on the 2nd of March, 1787. He was 70 years old. He was buried in Burton. He left a brewery, a name, and 2 sons who'd have to decide what to do with both. William Jr. had no taste for the business. He was, by quiet family accounts, more interested in the comforts of a country gentleman than in the daily grind of malt and yeast and bookkeeping. Within a few years, he'd sold his half to his brother. Michael Bass took sole control in 1795. He was 36. He would run the brewery for the next 32 years. It was Michael Bass, the founder's son, not his grandson, who held the works through the wars with Napoleon, through the gathering of the British Empire into its high Victorian shape, and through the quiet catastrophe of 1822. In that year, the Tsar of Russia, retaliating against British tariffs, closed his ports to British beer. Burton's first great export market simply vanished. Casks that had been loaded in Hull for 30 years stopped being loaded. Orders dried up. The merchants who'd built fortunes on the Baltic ale trade, Wilson, Allsop, Bass, looked at their warehouses and asked the question every brewing town in England would eventually ask in its turn. Where else would the beer go? The answer, when it came, would come from a teapot in Burton and a quarrel between London and Calcutta. And by the time it had played out, the brewery on the high street would no longer be a respectable provincial concern. It would be the largest brewery in the world. Chapter 3. The beer that crossed oceans. 100 miles south of Burton, in the East End of London, a brewer named George Hodgson had been running a small operation in Bow since the 1750s. His brewery sat conveniently close to the East India Docks. From around 1790, he'd hit on a profitable arrangement with the captains of East India Company ships, selling them a strong, well-hopped, long-aged pale ale on generous credit terms, beer they could carry to India and sell at a premium to British soldiers and civil servants who couldn't get a decent pint anywhere east of Suez. He called it October beer, brewed in October, aged over winter, robust enough to survive the 4-month voyage round the Cape, the equatorial heat, the rolling of the holds, the slow seep of salt air into oak. For 30 years, Hodgson held the trade. He had no competition. Burton brewers were locked into the Baltic. London brewers were locked into porter. Heavy, dark, made for English taps, not Indian heat. Hodgson sat in between, alone, and grew rich. Around 1820, he made the mistake that cost him his empire. He pushed his customers too hard. He raised his prices. He shortened the credit terms. He set up a competing trading concern to bypass the captains who'd built his trade. The East India Company, watching its old supplier turn greedy, looked elsewhere and looked north, toward Burton, toward a town whose water made pale ale that nobody on the planet could match. Samuel Alsop was the man they approached. Alsop ran one of the bigger Burton breweries. The company's representative, a director named Campbell Marjoribanks, invited him to dinner in London and put a sample of Hodgson's October beer in front of him. Alsop took it home to Burton. He gave it to his head brewer, a man called Job Goodhead. The story, as it survived, went like this. Goodhead spat the first mouthful out. The bitterness affronted him. He was a Burton man, accustomed to Burton ale. This London brew was something else, harsher, more deliberate, engineered for a journey he'd never made, and a climate he couldn't imagine. He gathered himself. He looked at his employer. Then he said he could match it. He brewed a trial batch in a teapot. The teapot worked, and by 1823, Alsop was shipping his first cask of East India ale to Calcutta. Bass followed within months. So did Worthington. So did Thomas Salt. The Burton brewers had found their new market, and they had something Hodgson didn't have. The water that made the hops bite cleaner, the water that gave the beer that famous sulphurous edge, the snap of struck match, the bite of mineral, that would come to define India Pale Ale and the brewery that perfected it. Within a decade, Alsop and Bass together accounted for more than half the beer shipped to Calcutta, twice Hodgson's volume. The London man's monopoly was broken. By the 1830s, the two leading Burton brewers were sending 6,000 barrels of pale ale to India every year. By 1870, the trade had risen to 217,000 barrels. The Russian door had closed. The Indian door had opened, and it opened wider than the Baltic ever was, wider than anyone in 1822 could have imagined, because the British Empire, in the middle decades of the 19th century, was about to become the largest market for English ale that the world had ever seen. A pale, sharp, faintly sulphurous Burton ale, brewed in linked oak casks, shipped down the Trent, into the holds of East Indiamen at the Thames, and out across the oceans to a quarter of the planet. But the brewery that would dominate that market wasn't yet being run by the man who would make it the largest brewery on earth. That man was 18 years old when Hodgson lost his monopoly. His name was Michael Thomas Bass. He was the founder's grandson. And in 1827, when his own father died and the brewery passed into his hands, the concern was producing about 10,000 barrels a year. By the time he was finished, it would be producing 1 million. Chapter 4. Number 1. Michael Thomas Bass, the second man of that name in the family, but the first to make it famous, was born in 1799, 12 years after his grandfather had died. He was educated at Burton Grammar School and then in Nottingham, the son of his father Michael and his mother Sarah Hoskins, daughter of a Burton lawyer. He joined the family firm at the age of 18. He took control at 28 when his father died unexpectedly. He was, by most accounts, an unspectacular man in conversation. The trade journal that knew him best, the Brewer's Journal, said he was known more for his regular attendance than for any feats of oratory. He wasn't the kind of man who walked into a room and dominated it. He was the kind who sat down, listened, and quietly noted what needed to be done. What needed to be done in 1827 was scale. The brewery he inherited was solid but small, 10,000 barrels a year. The water beneath Burton could brew far more than that. The Trent and Mersey Canal could carry far more than that. The newly opened railways, for the railway age was just beginning, the Stockton and Darlington had opened 2 years before he took control, could carry far more than that. And the empire that bought the beer would, within his own lifetime, expand to take far more than that. Michael Thomas Bass spent 57 years at the head of the company. He brought in partners. First, he renewed the arrangement with John Ratcliffe, the man his father had taken on, and then around 1837 he added John Gretton, whose family would still be on the board a century later. The firm became Bass, Ratcliffe and Gretton, the name on the cask, the name that would soon mean pale ale across the British Empire. He built. He bought adjacent land along the High Street and beyond. He sank new wells. He laid new floors. He erected new buildings around the original brewery until the works covered acres of central Burton. And then he kept building. He opened a second brewery in 1853, the Middle Brewery, and a third in 1864, the New Brewery. The town began to organise itself around the works. Streets were laid out to serve the brewery. Houses were built to house the workers. The railways that had reached Burton in the 1830s ran sidings into the brewery yards. By 1860, output had passed 340,000 barrels, 34 times what it had been when he took control. The water mattered. The system mattered too. In Burton, by the middle of the century, brewers had perfected something called the union system, a method of fermenting beer in linked oak casks fitted with swan-neck pipes that fed an overhead trough. The yeast rose, was separated off, the cleaned wort returned. The result was beer of extraordinary clarity, with the bright, lively character, an appealing sparkle, one Victorian writer called it, that made Burton Pale Ale instantly recognisable in a glass. The man credited with bringing it to the town was an incomer named William Walker, who'd licensed it to the brewers who could afford to install the gear. Bass installed hundreds of sets. The union system would brew Bass beer for over a century, the last of them not retired until 1983. And there was a smell. For 2 centuries, Burton smelled of its own water. The sulfates in the gypsum, working through the brewing, threw off a sharp, faintly eggy, faintly struck match note that hung in the air on a still day. Locals called it the Burton Snatch. Visitors who'd never met it before stopped in the street the first time they caught it. It was the smell of yeast working, the smell of malt, the smell of the chemistry of the place, and the drinkers who knew their Bass came to expect it in the glass. A snappy, sulphury aroma, a creamy off-white head, the nutty flavour of the two-strain Bass yeast, a touch of sophistication, the trade said, that couldn't be brewed anywhere else on the planet. The reputation followed the beer followed the railways followed the empire. By the 1860s, Bass was being drunk on every inhabited continent. James Hogg, writing a popular volume called Fortunes Made in Business in 1884, said this of the brand: "It is no extravagant assertion to say that throughout the world there is no name more familiar than that of Bass. You meet the refreshing label up among alpine glaciers and down in the cafes of the Bosphorus, among the gondolas of the Grand Canal at Venice and the junks of China." He wasn't exaggerating. In 1882, the French painter Edouard Manet, working on what would become one of the most studied paintings in the history of European art, placed 2 bottles of Bass Pale Ale on the marble counter of his bar at the Folies Bergère, the red triangle clearly visible on the labels. Picasso, painting in Paris 30 years later, would use the same red triangle in more than 40 of his Cubist works. In the Oxen of the Sun episode of James Joyce's Ulysses, Leopold Bloom watches a barman uncork a bottle of Bass and notes the label. The label had become more than a label. It had become a sign. And on the 1st of January, 1876, that sign was registered. The Trademarks Registration Act of 1875 came into effect on New Year's Day, 1876. On New Year's Eve, the Bass Company sent an employee down to London with instructions to be first in the queue at the patent office when it opened the following morning. He stood outside through the cold night. He was first through the door. The red triangle was registered as United Kingdom Trade, Mark No. 1. The red diamond, for Bass's stronger ale, was registered next. Then, the brown diamond. The first protected commercial marks in British legal history all belonged to a single Burton brewery. The triangle itself had been in use as a cask mark for nearly 40 years already, painted on Bass barrels since around 1837. But the law had finally caught up. From that morning on, no other brewery in Britain could put a red triangle on a barrel of beer. By 1877, Bass was the largest brewery in the world. 1 million barrels a year. The figure carries less weight in print than it deserves. 1 barrel was 36 imperial gallons. 1 million barrels was 36 million gallons of pale ale, leaving Burton every 12 months. The entire annual output of George Hodgson's Bow Brewery in its heyday, the brewery that had taught Burton how to make beer for India, would have fitted inside a quiet corner of the Bass yards. By the late 1880s, the works covered 145 acres of central Burton. The brewery employed more than 2,500 workers. Within a 4-decade period, the town's total brewery output had risen from 70,000 barrels to 1.75 million. There were 31 breweries in Burton at the peak. Bass alone accounted for 1/3 of the output. Michael Thomas Bass had taken his grandfather's small concern and built the largest beer-making operation that had ever existed on the planet. He sat in Parliament for 35 years, member for Derby, first as a radical, then as a liberal from 1859. He used the wealth as quickly as he could give it away. The Free Library and Museum at Derby, opened on the 28th of June 1879, cost him £25,000 of his own money. The Bass Recreation Ground, the swimming baths, the School of Art. In Burton, the Town Hall, St. Paul's Church. His obituarists estimated his lifetime donations at £80,000, a sum equivalent, in the money of the 1880s, to many millions today. He declined a peerage offered by Gladstone, preferring to remain in the Commons. His own philosophy, recorded in his lifetime, was simple enough. "I have made a lot of money. I have had much pleasure in making it. But I had much more pleasure in giving it away." When he died in 1884, his estate was valued at £1,800,000. He was one of the richest men in Britain who'd never held a title. The company he left behind would become a public limited company 4 years later, in 1888, Bass, Ratcliffe and Gretton Limited, listed on the London Stock Exchange. By the time it joined the original FT30 in 1935, it had been a household name for 3 generations. By that point, if you'd ridden a train from London to Edinburgh, you'd have passed Bass advertisements painted on every other gable. If you'd walked through any town in the Empire, you'd have seen the red triangle on a pub sign. If you'd ordered a drink in Calcutta or in Sydney or in Cape Town, you'd have been asked if you wanted a Bass. And in Burton, in the brewery yards that ran for acres in every direction from the high street, the men were laying down the next era of works. Bigger floors, bigger stables, bigger maltings, and the first miles of a private railway that would, by the end of the century, run 16 miles inside the brewery walls and cross the public streets of the town at 32 level crossings of its own. The peak was still ahead. Chapter 5. 16 Miles of Iron. There were people in Burton who'd grown up hearing the brewery before they'd learned to walk. The works hooter at 6 in the morning, the clang of a level crossing gate at the bottom of the high street, the slow rumble of a tank wagon pulling away from the loading bay, brake shoes squealing on the rails as it eased into a curve no mainline railway would ever have tolerated. The sound that meant your father was already inside and your grandfather had been inside before him. By the 1880s, Bass owned the country's largest private internal rail network, 16 miles of full-gauge track, 11 locomotives by 1880. The figure climbed through the 1890s. The brewery, by then, was no longer simply a brewery. It was an industrial city, contained inside the boundaries of an ordinary Staffordshire market town and laid out with the logic of a port. You came in through the gates on Station Street. The maltings rose in front of you with their distinctive louvred roofs, low buildings, long, designed to let the air move across the grain as it germinated and dried. Inside the maltings, the floor maltsters turned the barley by hand twice a day with wooden shovels, walking across acres of warm grain. The smell was almost sweet. The work was constant. The maltster who turned that grain might do so for 30 years, his shoulders adapting to the rhythm of the shovel until he could no longer remember a time when his arms hadn't ached at the end of a shift. From the maltings, the kilned grain travelled to the brewhouse. You moved with it. You walked past the cooperage, and here was where the noise began to gather. 400 coopers worked at Bass in 1889 alone. 400 men shaping oak from the Russian Baltic, the memel oak the brewery had used for a century, working casks by hand with mallet and drift, and a vocabulary of tools that hadn't changed since the trade was a guild. The hammering carried through the brewery walls. Visitors from London, and there were many, for the brewery had become a destination on its own right by the 1880s, wrote home about it. It sounded, one of them said, like an army of carpenters at a wedding. Inside the brewhouse, the great copper kettles boiled the wort. Steam rose to the rafters and condensed on the cast-iron beams. The Burton Snatch, that sharp, sulphurous struck-match aroma that Burton brewing threw off as the water reacted with the boiling malt, filled the air. You could taste it on the back of your tongue. Outside, in the streets of the town, it hung over Burton like a kind of weather. Locals barely noticed. Visitors stepped off the trains at Burton Station and stopped on the platform. "What is that?" a man from London asked a porter in 1890. The porter looked at him with the patient amusement Burton kept for outsiders. "That's Bass, sir. That's the smell of Burton." From the brewhouse, the green beer flowed into the union rooms, hundreds of oak casks linked together by their swan neck pipes, the fermenting beer climbing up the necks and overflowing into the trough above, the yeast separating, the cleaned wort returning to the cask. The union system. The sound of it was a kind of low, busy murmur, the constant working of yeast, the dripping of the trough, the wooden creak of casks settling on their stillions. The men who worked the unions were specialists. They moved between rooms, checking gravity, checking temperature, drawing samples into pewter mugs and tasting them, marking the casks with chalk. A union man might brew with the same yeast strain his father had brewed with. The two-strain Bass yeast, the live culture that gave Bass its nutty edge, was tended like a flock. From the unions, the beer ran into the racking room. Casks were filled, bunged, hammered with the cooper's mark, and rolled out onto the loading dock. From there, the railway took them. The Bass Railway was its own world. It ran from the brewery yards, out through the gates at 32 separate level crossings, sidings cutting across High Street, Station Street, Guild Street, Wetmore Road, threading between Bass's various sites and the mainline stations. An 1859 petition by Burton townsfolk against the street crossings had failed spectacularly. One of the signatories had been W. H. Worthington, the rival brewer. The town had lost. The brewery had won. Crossing keepers manned the gates from before dawn until after dark, swinging them shut as the engines approached, raising a hand to halt the cabs and carriages on the public roads. L.S. Lowry painted one of those crossings. He called the painting simply The Crossing. The keeper stood in his hut, the gates were closed, and the matchstick figures of Burton waited in the street, while the brewery went about its business. The chief railway engineer from 1891 was a man named Herbert Couchman. He ran the Base Internal Railway as if it were the London and North Western. Timetables, signalling, locomotive numbering, full operating discipline. He stayed in post for 26 years, until 1917, and the practices he established lasted into the late 1960s, long after the steam engines themselves had been replaced. His locomotives carried Bass livery. They had names. The crews who drove them were brewery men, not railwaymen. They wore Bass overalls. They took their orders from the brewery superintendent, and they brought the beer out of the works at the pace and the precision of a brewery production line. When the Midland Railway built St Pancras Station in London in the 1860s, the engineers designing the great undercroft beneath the platforms, the famous brick vaults that today hold upmarket shops and a champagne bar, spaced their iron support columns to a particular formula. The spacing was set to a set number of beer barrels, base beer barrels. The undercroft of St Pancras was, in its first life, a beer warehouse, and Bass was its largest tenant. The architecture of a London terminus had been organised at the brick-and-mortar level around the dimensions of a Burton cask. This was scale of a kind that had no British precedent. The works were a city, the railway was a circulatory system, and the men who walked through the gates every morning were the lifeblood that kept it moving. Chapter 6. A town that smelled of its own water. There were families in Burton who'd been brewing Bass beer for 4 generations. The Coopers, the Baileys, the Smiths. Many of them had come up from Suffolk in the middle of the 19th century. Suffolk men who'd worked the East Anglian breweries when the railways had reached Bury and Ipswich, then followed the work north to Burton when the Burton brewers had needed labour. They settled in the streets that Bass had built. Guild Street, the main route out toward Derby, had been laid down by Bass itself, leased today to the local council, but Bass land then, owned, paved and named by the company. The terraces ran row after row in the streets behind the brewery, brick-built, 2 up, 2 down, with a yard at the back and an outhouse at the end of the yard. The rent was modest, the work was steady, and the wage packet on a Friday afternoon was the heaviest in Staffordshire. A boy growing up in one of those terraces in the 1890s knew his future before he'd left school. He'd start as a brewery messenger or a cooper's apprentice at 14. He'd learn his trade for 7 years. He'd marry a girl from a Bass family and move 2 streets over and have children who'd themselves go through the brewery gates at 14. He'd retire at 65 with a Bass pension. He'd be buried, when his time came, in a Burton churchyard with a Bass collection paying for the headstone. His wife, in the meantime, might work in the bottling halls. Women's work in Burton brewing was real work. By the 1880s, the bottling lines employed hundreds of women, washing returned bottles, filling, labelling, packing into crates. The pay was lower than the men's. The hours were as long, but it was a wage in a town where a household with 2 brewery incomes lived better than a household with 1. The pubs of Burton were the social organs of the brewing trade. The Cooper's Tavern on Cross Street, the Burton Bridge Inn, the Bass Sports and Social Club, built and funded by the company for its workers, the Trades Union office on Station Street, the Transport and General Workers Union held the brewery floor, the Union of Shop, Distributive and Allied Workers, USDAW, held the bottling halls. Trade unionism in Burton was not the radical embattled unionism of the South Wales coalfields or the Clyde shipyards. It was steady, organised, present. The brewers and the unions sat across tables together. The brewers were generally reasonable. The unions were generally moderate. The work, until well into the 20th century, was generally there. The town's social calendar moved to the rhythm of the brewery. The mayor of Burton was, more often than not, a Bass executive or a Worthington partner. The school governors were brewery men. The chapel deacons were brewery men. The cricket club was the Bass Cricket Club. The fire brigade was, in its origins, the Bass Fire Brigade. The brewery owned more pumping equipment than the town council ever had, and when fires broke out in the streets behind the works, the brewery's brass-helmeted firemen rolled out before the borough men had finished pulling on their boots. And there were the horses. Hundreds of dray horses lived in the Bass stables. Great Shire animals, 18 hands at the shoulder, with feet the size of dinner plates and a calm temperament cultivated over generations of careful breeding. They pulled the drays through the streets of Burton from before dawn, delivering beer to the local pubs and hauling casks between the brewery sites. The clop of their hooves on the cobbles in those years before motor lorries was the sound of the morning in Burton. The smell of their stables, leather, dung, fresh straw, oats, mingled with the smell of the brewery itself. And together, those two smells made up the working atmosphere of a Staffordshire town that lived by beer. The brewery looked after its men. It paid in cash on a Friday. It ran its own clubs and its own pension fund and its own social institutions. It also ran something nobody else in industrial Britain quite matched. It ran the Bass excursions. The first one had gone out in 1865 on the personal instruction of William Bass, not the founder, but a descendant carrying the name. 1,000 workers had been put on 2 trains and sent to Liverpool for the day, all expenses paid by the brewery. The idea took root. By 1883, the excursions were annual, run with the kind of military precision that nothing in Britain had yet attempted on that scale by a private employer. Paid holidays did not legally exist for industrial workers in the United Kingdom until 1938. Bass had been giving its workers a day at the seaside for over half a century before Parliament made it law. The man who ran the excursions was named William Walters. He had organised every trip from 1865 onward, and he kept on organising them year after year, decade after decade, until he retired at the age of 74 in December 1915, after 50 years of service. He produced a handbook for every adult passenger, a tradition begun in 1893. The handbook gave the train times, the locations of the public toilets, a tourist guide to the destination, swimming advice. Do not bathe immediately after a hearty meal, and after bathing take a brisk walk. And a list of the places along the seafront where a man could get a draft bass without disappointment. It was signed off, year after year, by William Walters. In 1900, more than 11,000 workers travelled to Blackpool in a single day. The trains ran from before 4 o'clock in the morning. The town of Blackpool effectively became a Burton suburb for 12 hours. Hotels along the front had Bass on tap and Bass workers in every other seat. The pier looked, that evening, as though half of Staffordshire had emptied itself onto the Lancashire coast. The final excursion went on Friday, the 24th of July, 1914. 14 specially chartered trains, 7,000 brewery workers and their families. The trains pulled out of Burton from 3:40 in the morning, bound for Scarborough on the Yorkshire coast. Every adult on board received Walters's handbook. Every child had a wrapped lunch. The day was sunny. The sea was warm. The handbooks listed the pubs along the front. The Bass families spread out across the promenade and the sands and the gardens above the cliffs, and the photographers from the Burton newspapers worked their way through the crowds, taking group portraits. Nobody on that beach knew it was the last one. 11 days later, on the 4th of August, Britain declared war on Germany. The 1915 excursion to Blackpool, which would have needed 20 trains, was cancelled. The workers were given a half-day holiday and a gift of between 2 and 5 shillings each. The Bass excursions never ran again. The Scarborough trains of July 1914 became, without anyone planning it, the last great works outing in the history of British industry. Chapter 7. The Trademark of an Empire. If you had walked into a bar in Calcutta in 1885 and asked for a pale ale, the barman would have reached for a bottle with a red triangle on its label and set it in front of you without a word being exchanged. If you had ridden a sledge across the Yukon in 1898 with a Klondike prospector, the bottle in his pack would have carried the same red triangle. If you had stood at the rail of a steamer crossing the Suez Canal in 1905 and looked out toward the Egyptian shore at sunset, you would have seen, among the warehouses along the canal bank, a brick gable painted with an advertisement for Bass. The red triangle was a sign that travelled. It went where the British Empire went, and it went a good deal further. James Hogg's 1884 catalogue of British business success had not been writing in metaphor when he placed Bass on the gondolas of the Grand Canal and the junks of China. He had been describing what he had seen. The brewery's domestic dominance was easier to measure. By the mid-1880s, 1 in every 4 pints of beer drunk in Britain came from Burton, and the largest share of Burton's output was Bass. The London bottlers, firms like Reed Brothers and W.E. Johnson, ran businesses dedicated solely to bottling and distributing Bass under license. The export houses in Liverpool and Hull ran their schedules around the Bass shipping calendar. Pubs all over the country signed loan tie agreements that kept Bass on the bar in return for favourable interest on their fittings. In London, Bass beer was advertised on the side of horse-drawn buses. In Manchester, it was painted on railway bridges. In Edinburgh, it was sold across the bar of every respectable hotel. The Royal Connection arrived in 1902. To mark the visit of King Edward VII to the Bass Brewery, the king had a personal taste for pale ale, a man of generous appetites in every direction. The company brewed a special commemorative ale. It was called simply King's Ale. It was bottled with a cork rather than a crown, sealed with wax, and a quantity of it laid down. The bottles became collector's items within a decade. A few of them survive to this day. They sit in private cellars and brewery archives and museum cases, still containing, at least nominally, beer brewed for a king who died in 1910. They are perhaps the most famous bottles of beer in British history. There was an even older marker than the King's Ale. In 1869, to celebrate the birth of a son to one of the firm's directors, John Gretton's family, that line of the partnership, the brewery had laid down a small quantity of an exceptional dark ale called Ratcliffe Ale. The bottles were laid in the brewery cellars to be opened on the boy's 21st birthday in 1890. Some were opened, most were not. They went into circulation among the brewery's friends and customers, and they too survive, in quantities, today. Bass had become something that beer brands in Britain had never quite been before. It had become an artefact, a piece of British culture in its own right, the kind of thing painters put in their paintings and novelists put in their novels, not because Bass was particularly literary, but because by the second half of the 19th century, the red triangle was simply part of the visual furniture of being British. It was on the bar. It was on the bottle in the pantry. It was on the gable of every other railway bridge. Manet painted it because Manet was painting modern Paris, and modern Paris drank Bass. The peerage came in 1897. Michael Arthur Bass, son of the second great Michael Thomas, grandson of the founder's son, was raised to the House of Lords as the first Baron Burton. The family had finally accepted the honour their patriarch had once declined. The Bass family had become aristocracy by the most unambiguously British route imaginable. They had brewed their way there. The company itself went public in 1888. Bass, Ratcliffe and Gretton Limited, listed on the London Stock Exchange, with the Bass and Gretton and Ratcliffe families retaining significant blocks of shares and significant seats around the board. When the original FT30 was constituted in 1935 as the first British share index, Bass was on it, one of the 30 companies considered to represent the structural backbone of the British economy. The brewery on the High Street in Burton-upon-Trent was no longer a brewery. It was an institution. Chapter 8. The highest point before the fall. The peak years carried no anxiety about themselves. By 1888, Bass covered 145 acres of central Burton. It employed more than 2,500 workers directly, and supported many thousands more indirectly through the maltings, the cooperage, the rail trade, and the network of pubs and bottlers that depended on Bass volume to stay in business. Output approached 1 million barrels a year. The brewery operated 3 brewing complexes, hundreds of union sets, a private rail network, its own engineering workshops, its own fire brigade. It exported to every inhabited continent. Its trademark was the first registered in British law. Its bottles appeared in the paintings of the greatest French artist of his age. Its founder's grandson had died one of the richest men in Britain. Visitors who toured the works in the 1880s and 1890s wrote about it the way later generations would write about the great car plants of Detroit or the steel mills of Pittsburgh. The scale, they said, was difficult to communicate to anyone who hadn't seen it. The brewery was not an industrial concern. It was a small civilization, contained inside a market town, organized around a single product, producing on a scale that nobody had seen before in any beverage industry anywhere. The view from inside was one of total confidence. The Bass family had been brewing for over a century. The trade had grown without interruption for 3 generations. The export markets had only ever expanded. The British Empire, the principal customer, was at its territorial maximum. The pubs of Britain were a captive distribution network. The workers were loyal, the unions were moderate. The water beneath Burton would never run dry. The water above Burton, the rain that fed the gypsum strata, would never stop falling. There were 31 breweries in Burton at the turn of the century. The town had become a single industry city, with the largest brewery on the planet at its heart, and the second and third largest within a quarter of a mile. The trains pulled into Burton Station, and visitors stepped down onto the platform and stopped to inhale the air. Sulfur, hops, malt, the smell of money being made. Standing on those platforms in July 1914, with the Bass excursion trains pulling out for Scarborough at 3:40 in the morning, no observer could have produced a coherent argument for the proposition that any of this was about to change. The work was perpetual. The empire was permanent. The pale ale would continue to flow from the high street through the railways and the docks to the corners of the earth. It was the summit. It was the highest point before the fall. But the cliff was not yet visible. The wars that would reorder the world had not yet been fought. The technologies that would make pale ale a minority taste, refrigeration, lager, the cold chain, had not yet arrived in force. The empire that bought the beer was not yet visibly contracting. The pub estate that distributed it was not yet under regulatory threat. The brewers in their offices on the high street looked out across the works and saw the world they had inherited from their fathers, intact and expanding. Nobody inside those gates, on that July morning, could see what was coming. A century of war and consolidation and policy and ownership change. The slow attrition of Burton brewing through the middle decades of the new century. The rise of the supermarket and the can. The collapse of the export markets as the empire dissolved. The mergers of the 1960s that would absorb Bass into something called Bass Charrington and then into something called Bass plc. The political earthquake that would arrive at the end of the 1980s, presented in Whitehall as a competition reform that would shatter the entire tied house system on which British brewing had been organised for 200 years. The sale, after that, of the brewing arm to a Belgian conglomerate. The transfer of the name itself out of British hands. The reduction of the great works on the high street to a contract brewing operation for a beer owned by other people. The closure, in the end, of the museum that tried to preserve the memory. None of it was visible. The excursion trains pulled out of Burton at dawn. The workers went to Scarborough. They came home in the evening with the children asleep on their laps. The handbooks went into the drawers of dressers in the terraced streets behind the brewery. William Walters went home to bed. 11 days later, a war began that would mark the beginning of the long descent. Chapter 9. The Gathering Storm. The First World War took 1,000 Burton men out of the brewery and put them on the Western Front. Not all of them came home. The Second War, 25 years later, took another generation and converted half the bottling lines to munitions. Bass adapted. Bass always adapted. The trade resumed after each catastrophe, and the gates stayed open and the works hooter still sounded at 6. But the world that bought the beer had begun to shift on its foundations, and the men who ran Bass in the years after 1945, competent, decent men, in the main, who had grown up inside the company, could not always see the shape of what was changing around them. The British Empire had been the customer. The British Empire was dissolving. By 1960, the export markets that had carried 200,000 barrels a year of Burton ale at the high noon of imperial trade were a fraction of what they'd been. The pubs of Britain were still drinking, but they were drinking differently. The young men coming home from war and national service had developed a taste for cold lager, picked up in Germany or Italy or the Middle East. The cold chain had arrived. The refrigerated keg had arrived. The bright, cold, fizzy beers that came out of taps under gas pressure were beginning to push the warm, flat, cask-conditioned pale ales off the bar. And in boardrooms across British brewing, an idea had taken hold. The idea was scale. In 1961, Bass merged with the Birmingham brewers, Mitchells and Butlers, to form Bass, Mitchells and Butlers. Sir James Grigg took the chair. M&B's chief executive, a man named H. Allen Walker, moved across to take operational command. He was a forceful man. Some who served under him called him dynamic. Others, in private and later in print, used less generous words. One beer historian, writing a generation later, called him a domineering lunatic with no knowledge of the brewing industry. Walker was not finished. In 1967, he engineered a further merger between Bass, Mitchells and Butlers and the Charrington United Breweries Group, which had itself been formed 5 years earlier from a London brewer and a Canadian operator named Eddie Taylor. The new combine was called Bass Charrington. It controlled over 11,000 pubs. It was, on paper, the largest pub and brewing group in Britain. H. Allen Walker, now 60, became chairman. He had a plan. The plan was to supply the entire United Kingdom from 2 breweries, Cape Hill in Birmingham, which would handle the south, and a vast new plant at Runcorn, on the Mersey, which would handle the north. Everything else, the dozens of historic regional breweries that the merger had absorbed, would be closed. The Runcorn Brewery opened in 1973. It cost a fortune. It never worked properly. The beer that came out of it was inconsistent. The drinkers who tasted it didn't like it. The pubs that were forced to take it complained. One brewing historian later described Runcorn as the British brewing industry's answer to British Leyland. It limped on for 2 decades and was finally closed in 1993, written off as a generational mistake. What Walker had destroyed in the process was the regional brewing geography of half of England. Bents, Williamstones of Sheffield, Jewels of Stone, whose closure in 1972 prompted one of the earliest protest marches by a new pressure group called the Campaign for Real Ale, William Hancock of Cardiff, Hewitt Bros of Grimsby. The names went out one by one. The local taps went dry. The regional pub trade that had organised itself around 2 centuries of local brewing was being centralised, mechanically, into a national lager pipeline that nobody outside the boardrooms had asked for. In Burton itself, the cask-conditioned Worthington E became the company's draft flagship. The keg version went onto pumps all over the country. Carling Black Label, the lager brand Walker himself had named in the late 1950s in deliberate imitation of automotive branding, became the company's lager flagship. Cask Bass continued, but it was no longer the priority. The priority was volume. The priority was efficiency. The priority was the new world of national distribution. In 1969, Bass Charrington moved into hotels. Crest Hotels was the first venture. In 1988, under a new chairman who had risen through the ranks, the company bought Holiday Inns International, completing a buyout that, by February 1990, had cost some $2.25 billion. The new chairman, Sir Ian Prosser, told the press that Bass was now the largest hotelier in the world. He used the word number 1. He had a portfolio of 1,600 hotels and 300,000 rooms. Prosser was a Bath grammar school boy who had reached the top by way of a Birmingham accountancy training and a steady rise through the Bass finance function. He had taken over as chief executive in 1987. He became chairman in 1990. He was knighted in the New Year Honours of 1995. He saw the future of Bass not in the brewing yards of Burton, but in the hotel atriums of the world's airports. And from the moment he took the chair, he began to organise the company around that view. By the time the lawyers in Whitehall delivered their report on the British brewing industry on the 21st of March, 1989, Bass was already 3/4 of the way to becoming something other than a brewer. The report was the lit match. The petrol had been pouring for a decade. Chapter 10. The Beer Orders. The Monopolies and Mergers Commission report ran to several hundred pages. Its title was bureaucratically exact: The Supply of Beer, a report on the supply of beer for retail sale in the United Kingdom. Its formal designation was Command Paper CMS in 651. Its chairman was Sir Sidney Lipworth QC, a careful lawyer who had spent 2 years examining the structure of the British pub trade. The findings were not in serious dispute. The Big Six brewers, Allied, Bass, Courage, Grand Metropolitan, Scottish and Newcastle, and Whitbread, together accounted for 75% of UK beer production, 74% of the brewer-owned retail estate, and 86% of the loan ties that bound free houses to particular suppliers. Bass alone owned around 7,300 tied pubs, the largest estate of any brewer in the country. The Commission concluded, unanimously, that a complex monopoly existed in favour of brewers who owned tied houses. What to do about it was where the trouble began. The Commission recommended that no brewer should be allowed to own more than 2,000 pubs. The Big Six would have to sell off the rest. The intention, as everyone in Whitehall later insisted, was to break the cartel and give independent brewers and consumers access to the bar. One commissioner dissented. His name was Leif Mills. He was the lone trade unionist on the panel, included as a representative of pub-goers and beer drinkers. He filed a note describing the proposed reform as an unnecessary leap in the dark, warning that it might reduce competition rather than enhance it. He was outvoted. His note was filed, noted, and overlooked. The Secretary of State for Trade and Industry was Lord Young of Graffham. He received the report. He read it. He went before the House of Commons on the 21st of March, 1989, and announced that he was minded to implement the recommendations. It was a phrase he would, by his own later admission, live to regret. In the formal language of Whitehall, minded to implement was an invitation to representations, a signal that consultations would now begin and that interested parties could come forward with arguments either way. Peter Luff, who was then a special advisor at the Department of Trade and Industry and later became a Conservative MP, recalled the moment with a careful sigh. They had expected dialogue, he said. Instead, all hell broke loose. The Brewers' Society, the trade body of the industry, mounted a campaign of extraordinary intensity. National newspaper advertisements warned of mass pub closures. The reforms were branded a charter for chaos. Aristocratic brewing families with seats in the House of Lords, the so-called beerage, mobilised Conservative backbenchers, many of whose constituencies were quietly supported by brewery donations. The trade unions, fearing for brewing jobs, lobbied just as hard. The Transport and General Workers' Union pressed the government from one side. The Confederation of British Industry pressed it from another. CAMRA and the Consumers Association supported the reforms. Labour MPs branded the eventual retreat a cave-in to the brewers' lobby and pointed out that brewers were among the largest Conservative Party donors. Lord Young was replaced as Trade Secretary by Nicholas Ridley. Ridley was a free market man by instinct, and many backbenchers expected him to reverse his predecessor's decision. He declined. The reforms went forward, but in a watered-down form. Instead of a hard 2,000 pub cap with forced sale of the rest, the Big Six were given 2 years to either sell or free of the tie half the difference between their estate size and the 2,000 threshold. The arithmetic added up to 10,791 pubs across the 6 companies. The 2 orders were laid on the statute book in December 1989. The supply of beer tied estate order, the supply of beer loan ties, licensed premises and wholesale prices order. The guest beer provision gave tenants of Big Six pubs the right to stock at least 1 cask-conditioned beer from outside the tie. Tenants were brought under the protection of the Landlord and Tenant Act of 1954. On paper, it was a careful and balanced reform. In practice, it was a hurricane that took the entire industry off its feet. The Big Six had been ordered to dispose of pubs. They had not been ordered to dispose of breweries. But the disposals did not go the way Whitehall had imagined. The Big Six, faced with a forced reduction of their tied estates, did the simplest and most economically rational thing available to them. They sold not just the pubs, but in many cases, the breweries too. And they sold the pubs not to small independent landlords, but to an entirely new kind of corporate entity that the legislators had not anticipated. It was called the Pubco, a pub-owning company that did not brew anything. Because it did not brew, it fell entirely outside the scope of the beer orders. Bass was at the centre of the new arrangement. In 1991, with the ink barely dry on the legislation, the company sold 368 of its lower-end pubs to a new corporate vehicle called Enterprise Inns. In 1997, it sold 1,450 of its leased pubs to another new vehicle called Punch Taverns, which then went on to absorb the Allied estate as well. Sir Ian Prosser sat in the chair through it all. The company that emerged on his watch was a leaner, more profitable, more hotel-focused enterprise, and one that had already begun to think of brewing not as the spine of the business, but as a division that might be sold. Across the industry, between 1989 and 1992, the Big Six between them shed roughly 12,500 pubs. Most of those pubs went not to independent operators, but to the new pubcos. By 1994, a quarter of all UK pubs were owned by companies that brewed nothing. By 2004, Punch and Enterprise each held more than 8,000 tied pubs, together around 17,400, and the new system of pub-owning conglomerates was being financed through a technique the City of London called securitisation, a structure one critic later described as a debt engine masquerading as a hospitality business. The beer orders had been intended to break a complex monopoly of 6 brewers and create a more competitive market for independent producers and pub tenants. Within 15 years, by the careful reckoning of the beer historian Martin Cornell, the British beer market was in the hands of 4 companies, only one of them British-owned. The Big Six had between them held 39 breweries before the beer orders. Only 8 of those breweries survived to 2010. The regional brewing landscape that had organised English drinking since the 18th century had been substantially destroyed. Leaf Mills, the one commissioner who had dissented, had been right. Peter Luff, looking back from the safety of retirement, conceded the point. In retrospect, he said, Leaf Mills got it about right. The orders were quietly revoked in 2003. By then, the damage was done. By then, Bass itself was no longer a brewer. Chapter 11. The name goes to Belgium. The decision arrived in February 2000. Sir Ian Prosser and his board had concluded by then that the brewing arm of Bass was no longer where the company's future lay. Hospitality was where the future lay. Hotels were where the future lay. Brewing was a mature, low-margin business in a country whose pub trade had been re-engineered by the beer orders into something nobody at Bass was confident they could thrive in. The brewing division, including Carling, by then the best-selling lager in the country, and the historic Bass Pale Ale itself, would be sold. The buyer arrived from Belgium. Interbrew was the family-owned brewing dynasty descended from the Stella Artois business, freshly floated on the Brussels Stock Exchange in 2000 and hungry for international scale. Its chief executive was a Canadian named Hugo Powell, who articulated the logic of the deal with the directness of his trade. The beer industry, he said, was consolidating. By operating as a local brewer at international scale, Interbrew could enjoy the best of both worlds. The agreement was reached in June 2000. The price was £2,300,000,000. It bought Interbrew not only the breweries, Burton, Tadcaster, Cape Hill in Birmingham, but the brands, Carling, Worthington, Bass Pale Ale, the Red Triangle itself, the single oldest registered trademark in British legal history, the sign that Manet had painted into the Folies Bergère and Picasso into his Cubist canvases, was now the property of a Belgian holding company. There was one further condition. Bass plc was no longer to be called Bass. The buyer wanted the use of the Bass name for its newly acquired beer business. The seller could not, therefore, continue to use it. The Bass family had brewed in Burton since 1777. The Bass name had appeared on the brewery gates for 223 years. From the moment the contract was signed, the company that had carried the name through all that time had to find another. The directors held an extraordinary general meeting on the 20th of July 2001. The shareholders, in turn, approved the change. On the 30th of July, Bass plc ceased to exist. In its place stood a company called Six Continents plc. The hotel's arm, Bass Hotels and Resorts, the corporate identity Sir Ian Prosser had assembled, became Six Continents Hotels. The company's prepared statement explained that Six Continents now operated 3,200 hotels and resorts in close to 100 countries across 6 continents. The corporate brief noted, in passing, that 7 continents had been considered and rejected. The company had no plans for hotels in Antarctica. It was a remark intended as light corporate humour. It was received in Burton as something rather different. The condition was firm. By the 21st of August 2002, the Bass name was to be off all the materials of the former parent company. The signs came down. The letterheads were reprinted. The shareholders, in due course, received their final communication from a company that had been on the London Stock Exchange for 113 years. But the Interbrew deal had run into a complication of its own. The Belgian company had, around the same time, also bought the brewing arm of Whitbread. The combined effect was to give Interbrew too much of the UK beer market for the competition authorities to tolerate. Patricia Hewitt, the Trade and Industry Secretary in the new Labour government, ordered Interbrew to dispose of either Bass Brewers or the Carling brewing operation. The matter went to the High Court in February 2001. In May, the court overturned the original ruling and sent it back for further consideration. The negotiation dragged on into the autumn. The deal was finally settled at 3 a.m. of Christmas Eve, 2001. The buyer was American. Coors, the Colorado brewer, then the 3rd largest beer company in the United States. The price was £1,200,000,000. Coors took the Carling and Bass brewing operations, the historic Burton site, the 4 UK breweries that came with it, the Carling and Worthington brands, the UK rights to Grolsch and Reef and Hooch. The Bass Pale Ale brand and the Red Triangle stayed with Interbrew. The Burton works themselves would, from early 2002, belong to an American family company based 1,500 miles inland from the nearest ocean. Coors' chief executive, Leo Keeley, told his shareholders that the deal offered operating margins roughly double what the Colorado business was used to. Coors' senior vice president, Rob Klugman, talking to the British trade press, was equally direct. They had invested over $1 billion. They planned to make the most of it. The chairman, Peter Coors, asked about the long-term plans for the historic brands now in his portfolio, observed with the candor that ran in his family that brands which had had their day would, in due course, have to face the consequences. The British arm was put in the hands of an executive named Jerry Fowden. Beside him, a former Bass Brewers man called Mark Hunter, who had joined the company in 1989, the year of the beer orders, and was about to spend the next 20 years inside the new ownership, played a central role. The takeover was completed in February 2002. The brewery on the High Street, where the Bass family had been brewing since the 18th century, was now a Coors operation. The name on the gates would soon say something else. The men inside the gates were no longer working for Bass. They were working for an American shareholder list. The Burton Snatch still hung in the air. The union sets, those that remained, still rattled. The water beneath the town was still drawn through the same gypsum. But the company that had brewed it was gone. Mark Hunter would in time become chief executive of the merged Molson Coors business, and eventually of the global group. The other Bass men dispersed. The Bass family, who had run the brewery for 223 years, was no longer in possession of its own name. Chapter 12. The Quiet Verdict. The 2003 split of 6 continents went through on the 15th of April. The hospitality empire that Sir Ian Prosser had spent 15 years assembling was broken in two. The hotel's business, together with the Britvic soft drinks operation, became Intercontinental Hotels Group, listed in London under the ticker IHG. The pubs and managed house retail business became Mitchells and Butlers, listed separately under the chairmanship of Roger Carr with Tim Clark as chief executive. The demerger was challenged by the corporate raider Hugh Osmond, who valued the assets at over $7.5 billion and called the existing company a poorly performing business that had consistently destroyed shareholder value. The board prevailed. The split went through. It was at the annual meeting that approved the demerger that an old Bassman finally spoke aloud what a great many people in Burton had been saying privately for 3 years. His name was Brian Wilson. He had spent his career at Bass Brewers. He had watched the whole sequence unfold. He stood up at the meeting and looked directly at the chairman in front of him. He asked Sir Ian Prosser whether he was not, just a little, ashamed of what had become of one of the greatest companies in British history. Prosser's reply was given without visible discomfort. He was not ashamed of the strategy. He was not, in fact, ashamed of anything. The exchange was reported. It travelled. It became, in the trade press and in Burton itself, the closest thing the story would ever get to a moment of public reckoning. The original Bass Brewery on the High Street closed in 2005. The closure was not, by the standards of British industrial collapse, a dramatic event. There was no last shift photographed in the local papers, no scaffolding around an iconic chimney, no march of workers out of the gates. The brewery had been a Coors operation for 3 years by then. The decision to consolidate production onto the larger adjacent site, the works built in 1898, was an internal one, taken in a Colorado boardroom. The buildings stayed standing. The union sets, what remained of them, were dismantled. The yeast culture moved. The men moved. The output continued. But the 18th century brewery that William Bass had bought in 1777 was no longer brewing. A line had been crossed that nobody marked at the time. Production of draft base, the cask-conditioned ale that had been the bedrock of the company for 2 centuries, continued under contract. Coors brewed it until 2005. After 2005, it was brewed by Wolverhampton and Dudley, Marston's as the company became, in their own Burton site, in Yorkshire Squares rather than the original Union casks. When Marston's itself was acquired by Carlsberg in 2022, the contract passed with it. Today, Draft Bass is brewed in Burton by Carlsberg, under the contract from AB InBev, the Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate that absorbed Interbrew in 2008 and now owns the Bass name itself. The veteran beer writer Roger Protz has called the arrangement uncomfortable, a Danish brewer making the most British of pale ales for its principal global rival in the town where the ale was born. The numbers tell what happened to the brand. In its prime, draft base accounted for around 800,000 barrels a year. By the early 2020s, production was down to around 30,000, a reduction of nearly 96%. The same beer, brewed broadly to the same recipe, in the same town. But the trade had walked away. The supporting infrastructure had walked away, and what remained was the residue of a brand that had once been on every bar in the British Empire. In 2008, Molson and Coors merged. The Bass Museum, which had opened in 1977 to mark the brewery's 200th anniversary, and which housed a collection of 500,000 artefacts going back 2.5 centuries, was closed by Coors on the 30th of June 2008. It had been costing Coors about £1 million a year to subsidise. A steering group reopened it as the National Brewery Centre on the 1st of May 2010, formally reopened by the Princess Royal in September. The legendary brewer Steve Wellington, who had brewed Bass since 1964, who had saved Worthington's White Shield from extinction in the 1990s, who was known in the trade as a Jedi master brewer, moved his small William Worthington Heritage Brewery into the centre and kept the craft alive. For 12 years, the National Brewery Centre stood on the original Bass site as the only dedicated museum of British brewing in the country. In September 2022, Molson Coors announced that it would be closed. Chapter 13. Office desks, where the museum stood. The reason given was a corporate office move. Molson Coors had agreed to sell its Carling House headquarters on the High Street to East Staffordshire Borough Council in a transaction valued at £5 million and tied to a £23 million regeneration fund. Some 500 head office staff needed to be rehoused. The company had chosen the National Brewery Centre site, adjacent to the brewery itself, as their new location. The announcement was made on the 14th of September 2022. The centre was to close on the 31st of October, 6 weeks' notice. The brewer of the Heritage Brewery, Martin Hodson, was made redundant, along with around 50 other staff. Brewing on the original Bass site, after 245 years, ended. The petition against the closure attracted more than 8,400 signatures. 400 people marched through Burton. The campaign was led by the former Member of Parliament Janet Dean and supported by CAMRA, the British Guild of Beer Writers, Burton Civic Society, Burton Chamber of Commerce and the local councils. CAMRA's National Director Gillian Hofe described the planned closure as a devastating loss not only to Burton but to the nation's brewing history. The MP for Burton and Atoxeter, Kate Kniveton, prepared a petition to present to Parliament. The beer writer Roger Protz said simply that British brewing heritage had been dealt a savage blow. A widely shared message captured what was happening in 5 words. When you close a museum, you close down memory. Molson Coors' UK and Ireland Managing Director, Phil Whitehead, said the company was committed to preserving the heritage currently housed at the centre. The Western Europe Operations Director, Fraser Thompson, observed that the company, as the town's largest employer, wished to remain based in Burton. The HR and Facilities Director, Adam Furby, explained that the relocation would bring the staff closer to the working brewery. The collection, 500,000 items, of which 5,000 were on display, was retained on the brewery site in the listed former Joiner's Workshop building. A collections officer named Laura Waters was funded by Molson Coors to oversee the catalogue and packing. Volunteers, including Malcolm Good, Brett Rathbone and Stephen Wilkins, worked through the archive over months, wrapping items in acid-free paper. A temporary National Brewery Archive Centre was approved at a former Ryman's stationery shop on Station Street, run by Waters and a team of volunteers under a 3-year temporary permission. A permanent National Museum of Brewing was projected for the listed Base House and Townhouse buildings off the High Street, the 18th century buildings where William Bass had founded his brewery in 1777. The scheme had been projected for approval in 2023 and construction by 2025. As of late 2025, the completion status was unclear in public sources. In March 2025, Molson Coors opened its new UK and Ireland headquarters on the former National Brewery Centre site. The global chief executive Gavin Hattersley visited. He spoke about the values of the company and its connection to the community and brewing heritage. The UK and Ireland Managing Director Simon Kerry called the new offices a symbol of an exciting new chapter. The buildings that had housed the museum housed office desks. The Shire horses were gone. The Heritage Brewery was gone. The fire engine collection, the Nalder and Nalder malt dressing machine, the running steam engine, the scrapbooks of the Red Triangle, were boxed in the joiner's workshop, waiting for a permanent home that had not yet been built. In August 2023, between the closure of the brewery centre and the opening of the new headquarters, Molson Coors made one further announcement. Worthington's White Shield, first brewed in Burton in 1829, 3 times CAMRA's champion, bottled beer of Britain, the longest surviving bottle-conditioned IPA in the country, was to be rested. The word was a euphemism. Production would cease. Steve Wellington, who had saved the brand once before and would have bought it from Molson Coors to keep it alive, was refused the chance. Roger Protz commented that the company might as well have said it had deleted the entire Beatles back catalogue and that fans could still enjoy Paul McCartney and the Frog Chorus. The Bass collection went into storage. The White Shield brand went into rest. The Bass Brewery on the High Street was an American-owned corporate office, and in the air above Burton, on a still day, you could still catch a faint trace of the Burton Snatch, drifting from the working brewery, where Carling and Coors and Madry were being made for the British market, where Carlsberg was contract brewing draft Bass for the Belgians, where 1 billion pints a year were still rolling out of a Staffordshire town that 2 centuries ago had brewed for the world. Chapter 14. What remains? The rails are gone. Where Bass's 16 miles of private track ran through the streets of Burton, the metal has been lifted and the ground tarmacked over. The level crossings have been concreted in. The keeper's hut from Lowry's painting is no longer there. Just about every trace of the brewery railway that ran through the town for 90 years has been erased or covered. The maltings with their louved roofs are mostly gone or converted. The cooperage shed where 400 men once hammered Memel oak into casks is gone. The stables that held hundreds of Shire horses are gone. The Bass family's house on the High Street still stands. Most of the buildings that made the brewery a city within a town stand in mixed states of preservation. Some listed, some flats, some warehousing, some waiting. Molson Coors still brews in Burton. The site employs around 500. Adjacent to the original Bass Works, the modern brewery is the largest the company operates in Western Europe, producing over 1 billion pints a year. Carling, Coors, Madry Exceptional, Staropramen, Provar, Cobra. The spent yeast goes to the Marmite factory along the road. The spent grain goes to local farms. A £100 million investment, announced in 2024, includes a new can filler and a heat pump system aimed at net zero by 2035. Burton is still a brewing town. It is no longer the brewing town. Of the 31 breweries that once stood in the town, a handful remain. Of the Bass family, who founded the world's largest brewery, registered the country's first trademark, sat in Parliament for 35 years, declined and then accepted a peerage, supplied a quarter of the British Empire with its ale, paid 1 in every 4 pints, drunk in Britain. No trace remains in the ownership or management of the company that bears their name. The name itself belongs to AB InBev in Luxembourg. The brewery belongs to Molson Coors in Colorado. The draft Bass is brewed under contract by Carlsberg in Denmark. The Bass excursions ran for a final time on the 24th of July, 1914. The brewery's 223rd year was the last under the Bass name. The museum closed in 2022. The White Shield was rested in 2023. There is a quiet that hangs over the streets behind the brewery now. The streets that William Bass laid out. The streets where 4 generations of Coopers and Baileys and Smiths brought up their children. The streets where the dray horses' hooves once made the cobbles ring at 4 in the morning. The hooter still sounds at the working brewery. The Burton Snatch still drifts on a still day. The water beneath the town still flows through the gypsum and tastes of nothing else on earth. But the brewery that drew that water out and made it famous, the brewery that registered the first trademark, that filled the bars of half the planet, that put 2 bottles on Monet's marble counter, that sent 14 trains to Scarborough on a July morning, 11 days before the world went to war, is gone. What remains is the name on a contract-brewed cask, a handful of buildings off the High Street, waiting to become a museum. a 500,000-piece collection wrapped in acid-free paper in the joiner's workshop, hoping for a home. And the memory, in a town that smelled of its own water for 200 years, and now smells of it a little less.